rougher on your
Well,
skin than cats.
my understanding is that uh, they're in the weasel family, and that a weasel has like the strongest bite per square inch of like any land mammal.
Oh wow. Yeah,
On
yeah, they
Earth.
are. They are in the weasel family for sure. Weasel, ferrets.
Deciding how I want this to look. You know what? How about this? Remove from scene, huh? I can pull it up when I'm ready. Look at that. So we're live, Nima.
No way.
Yeah.
Okay. That's all right. I'm ready. I'm well fed. I got my mic right here. I got my screen on the left, flashing the Bitcoin price to
Yeah, I
distract
got
me.
my boss tie on.
You get your boss tie. It's actually orange color, which is the color of Bitcoin.
It's
Very
red.
appropriate.
Is it coming across as orange for you? This is a red tie. This is like Christmas red.
Yeah, looks orange to me, but whatever.
Okay.
Maybe I'm colorblind.
Colorblind. Yeah.
What
Yeah,
are
colorblind.
colors anyway? All subjective.
Did I ever show you that video that there actually is a level of subjectivity to colors, not in their absolute sense, but in the way that we perceive them, and that certain cults, like you have to be taught to see
Yeah,
certain colors. Yeah, it's
you told
wild.
me that certain cultures they don't have a word for a certain color, and then they don't see it or something.
You
Something
don't
like
see
that.
it. Yeah, and like when you read ancient Greek literature, there is no mention of the word blue. And when you go through different cultures and into their like depending on how advanced they are, for example, if you look at some tribe in Africa or something, they don't recognize blue, but they can tell the difference between shades of green way better than we can. It's totally bizarre.
So maybe blue is just a shade of green for them.
Yeah, they showed it. They gave them a circle, kind of like a color wheel circle, and all of them were a certain shade of green, except one of them was blue. And when you and I look at that, we're like, oh yeah, that one's blue. It sticks it right out. And they showed it to these tribal people, and the tribal people had to like focus on it really hard before they're like, I think this one, and they point to the blue one. And then they gave them a second one where it was the same shades of green, and the one that was off was a slightly different shade of green. And then I have to look at it and go, okay, wait. I think it's that one. And then the tribal people were just instantaneously like, oh yeah, that one. Very different. That's
Interesting.
so bizarre.
Yeah, I guess your eyes,
Yeah.
your color perception is somehow tied to your language
Yeah.
centers. Maybe. I don't know.
Well, and then in Japan, there's this joke that everything, all green stuff is blue. Like when a light turns green, they say that the light is blue. And I always thought that was funny until I watched this video on like the history of colors. And apparently, once upon a time, Japan decided there were four colors: black, white, red, and yellow. And everything was just shades of that. And when you again take it in the context of what I just said, yeah, it's wild that like you could be taught to learn different colors. And then there was even saying in Russia, deep blue, like indigo versus light blue, they see as two completely different colors, not just like two different variations of blue.
Okay. Wow.
Riveting. Yes. Let's move on. So, Irita TV is going to be responding to some schizophrenia about the market and economics because unless you've got MMT or something that's similar to MMT to describe the way that economics works, you just end up with schizophrenic nonsense. Like we're going to be looking at here, we're going to be looking at the money supply and what the money supply can predict. And honestly, how do you measure the money supply? M1, M2, M3, what do these things mean? Do they measure anything? Let's get into that. So we pulled up this video of Heresy Financial. And we're going to see what this guy has to say and respond to it. So here we go.
Wait,
Oh, yep.
this one is saying why the money supply is growing again, but they have a different video where they say the money supply is collapsing at the fastest rate since the Great Depression.
Schizophrenic.
Let me send you that. Let's do that one.
I didn't realize it was literally the same guy. Okay, copy link. Which one? Hold on. Let me skip this damn commercial. Now, is it still sharing the old one?
Yes.
Oh no! Don't do this to me! Don't do this to me! Screen. Okay, we're gonna remove from scene. Stop sharing. Okay, hold on. It's this thing's wigging out. Big wig.
Okay. We're sorry for the interruption. Dylan has turned into an empty profile pic and a spinning wheel. Yeah, okay. I can hear you, yeah.
There. I'm back.
Yep, I see
Okay.
you.
Now that Nima can stop tap dancing, we'll share this screen. Money supply is collapsing. Okay. And then I'm going to add it to the scene. Boom. Okay. Here we go. You ready, Nima?
Yes,
Supply
I'm
is
ready.
shrinking by the fastest pace since the Great Depression. And by some measures, this is the first time the money supply has shrank since the Great Depression. The question is, does it actually matter? Now, it's important to recognize that when we're talking about the money supply shrinking, we're talking about fewer dollars in existence than there were before. Just like when the money supply expands, there are more dollars in existence than there were before. When the money supply shrinks, there are fewer dollars. When I was a kid, I remember reading stories about
Do you want to comment on that part real quick there, Nima?
Sure. So he's saying when the money supply rises, there's more money in bank accounts. When it drops, there's fewer money, or what do you say, in circulation or whatever? I don't know. But that's not really the case necessarily, because M2 is the money supply that the Federal Reserve still tracks, and M2 includes cash, checking deposits, savings deposits, money market funds, and CDs up to $100,000. So let's say I, for example, have money in my checking account and I want to earn some more interest, so I buy treasury bills with that. The M2 money supply drops, but my financial situation hasn't changed significantly. I'm just earning some more interest on a different financial asset. Uh, if you've listened to our previous, shows on modern monetary theory, etc., you understand that the true money supply is really all cash, savings accounts, and treasury bills, and even bonds in circulation. So that would be somewhere around $34 trillion or more. So um, the money supply dropping can indicate that there's less money in circulation, but it doesn't have to.
Well, and then I think it's important to point out here,
Sorry, I just got interrupted by my wife. Okay.
women interrupting.
Yeah. So yeah, money supply dropping. If it's happening because of budget surpluses by the government, all else being equal, that will shrink the money supply, and that'll indeed shrink all the money in circulation. But if investors are shifting money from checking into savings accounts, or rather from checking into treasury bills and bonds, that does not change the wealth of the private sector. And that in that case, looking at M2 could be misleading, could lead you to make bad decisions.
Right, well, and then I think that's worth pointing out or emphasizing heavily is, so there's this M2 graph that he's looking at, and M1, we were talking about this before we went on the air, M1 specifically looks at money that's not in savings accounts, like cash that exists, physical cash and stuff in checking accounts, and M2 includes savings accounts. It includes money markets, and it also includes CDs up to $100,000, essentially money that's in quotes easy to access. And then it doesn't consider, for example, treasury bonds to be money. So if I got $1 million that I decide to go and buy treasury bonds with, that's $1 million that falls out of the money supply.
Yeah.
Right. And the fact that it's not tracking that is kind of, I mean, it might correlate to reality, like Nima just said, or it might not, because you're not looking at the whole picture.
Yeah.
Which may lead to some schizophrenic.
Yeah. We can talk more about why the M2 collapsed as we go along with this.
Okay. Yeah. Let me see if I can pick where we were. Here we go.
When I was a kid, I remember reading stories about the Great Depression, and specifically how people would go to the bank to get their money and it wasn't there. And that question, that confusion stuck with me for a long time, because the money was there before. Where did it go? How can money come into existence or leave existence? Somebody's got to have it, right? When I get money myself, it comes from somebody else. And then when I pay some money to somebody else, it leaves me and goes to them. But I never see money actually come into existence or leave existence. So how does that happen? Where did all the money go? Well, it turns out that the answer to that question actually gives us insight into what happens when the money supply shrinks, and answers the question for us: does it actually matter? This is a chart that has been making its rounds on social media recently, and I apologize.
Let's take a look at this chart.
Yeah.
What's going on here? Well, let me maximize it to the highest extent I can. There we go.
Yeah, basically they're saying every time this blue line drops below the x-axis, it predicts a recession. And in some cases that may be true. Actually, in a lot of cases that's correct. But the question is, what was the context of that number dropping, or that blue line dropping, right?
And then also the definition of this blue line, now it's not saying M2, it's saying blended U.S. money supply. What does the blended U.S. money supply mean? Yeah,
it could be because there's different measures tracking over the years. So maybe someone has tried to harmonize those, and I don't really think it matters all that much.
Okay.
I mean, they're all going to be ignoring treasury bonds for the purpose of this figure. So, they're all deficient in that sense.
Well, and I think the fact that it doesn't matter emphasizes what does matter, which is what you just said, is that we might be comparing with that first chart that we looked at, or that he pulled up, apples. This might be oranges, but in either case, like you're saying, it's not including treasury bonds.
Yeah.
So you're going to come up with weird stuff no matter what. Okay, I'll keep. Let me switch the screen here.
And I mean, we have talked about a good predictor for recessions and depressions before, right? It's when net private savings dips below this line of zero. And net private savings can correlate with the money supply, but doesn't have to.
For the low quality. I tried searching for the original and I just couldn't find it anywhere. This is the highest res version I could find. But this is one measure of the money supply that goes back 200 years, all the way back to 1831. When the blue chart line is above the zero line, that means that the money supply is expanding, because this chart is a measure of the rate of change of the money supply. So when the rate of change is positive, that means the money supply is growing. There's more money coming into existence. When that rate of change is negative, that means the money supply is actually shrinking. You can
Nima, doesn't this get even more complicated? Because particularly before the Federal Reserve era, when you've got banks creating money out of nothing, because that's clearly a part of the money supply it is today, the rules were different back then in terms of how banks got to create money and how they had to hold reserves and that sort of thing. So, and I have a feeling that if some bank opened up in somewhere in the Midwest, that the money created by that bank in 1846 or 67 or whatever wasn't necessarily being tracked by Washington, D.C.
That's probably that could be true. That's also probably why they're calling it blended money supply. But even before the Federal Reserve era, there were banks here and there who took on that role of clearing payments between banks and stuff like that. So, I don't know where exactly these figures are coming from. And certainly what you're saying is true. It probably complicates it. But by and large, the idea of, you need some institution to do clearing, and they agreed back then here. There may have been different clearing houses in different areas of the country. So,
got it.
Yeah, I think that's what happened.
You can see that during 2022 and 2023, all the way at the right end of the chart, we are going through a monetary retraction. By this measure of the money supply, the last time the money supply started to shrink was in 1948 through 49, which happened alongside a recession. The time before that was in 1937 through 38, which also coincided with a recession. The time before that was in 1931, which coincided with the Great Depression. And in fact, every single time the money supply contracted, it coincided with either a recession or a depression or war or inflation or deflation.
It coincided with either inflation or deflation, Nima.
Okay. Something with badness happening.
Like here, something happened in the money supply, and literally anything as a result. That's not a strong correlation there. And it actually sidetracked me from what I wanted to say. Oh, yeah. Going back to this chart, it's not correlating to the 2008 recession, and it's not correlating to, I believe, wasn't there another recession in the 80s that happened?
Yeah, 81, that's true. And also you see here, 1913 through 1914, there's a dip right next to that. That doesn't seem to correlate with a recession. And then there's another one that's right before, so the second yellow shaded area.
From the side right here?
Yeah, there's a dip before that. Okay, I guess they're saying it leads to 18-month recession, but there's no yellow area. So I don't know. There's a recession when the money supply, you see the second yellow area here, the money supply actually exploded, and then there's a recession, and then it goes down. So, it doesn't necessarily look like a very reliable indicator. It just looks more like they're trying to create this correlation. But if you're there in that moment, would you have been able to use this method of predicting recessions, right? In
order to come up with a solution.
In 1865, 67, money supply was very high, and then yet it coincides with the recession, and then the money or even depression, I guess, civil war. Obviously, also civil war, all kinds of political
war kind of extenuating circumstance there.
Right. So this correlation, one way it doesn't seem to always work, right? Like you said, it didn't predict the 2008. However, our methodology of observing net private savings very much does. And so, not all recessions have been preceded by this kind of move, and this kind of move has not always precipitated a recession. So yeah, you can pick some figures here, and yeah, it may be, like I said, it may coincide on occasion with a decline in net private savings and ensuing decline in economic activity, recession, or like a hard drop, like a depression. But it doesn't have to. You have to consider the circumstances.
Well, and I think this latest yellow box, the one that's in quotes happening right now, is going to be the proof of that.
Yeah.
Let's keep watching. I'm sure he's going to talk about this last box here a little more now.
Contracted, it coincided with either a recession or a depression or war or inflation or deflation. It's also important to point out because many people look at the current situation and say, hey, well, the money supply is shrinking right now, a very small amount compared to how much the money supply expanded by right before that. And that is true. When we look at the total absolute level of the money supply, we had a massive expansion. But it's also true that when you look at all of the contractions in the money supply in the past, almost all of them directly follow a similar spike in the money supply. And that didn't change the outcome. And that actually makes sense because the only reason why you would have a contraction in the money supply is because of an artificial boom in the money supply. This is due to the boom bust cycle.
The only reason you would have a contraction in the money supply is if you had an artificial boom in the money supply right before it.
Right. So he's saying that if a massive bubble popping or depression or recession is preceded by an exuberant boom usually.
Right. Well, and then that's not necessarily true. I mean, we've talked about this before, and it comes down to whether or not the increase in the money supply is associated with an increase in private sector net savings, or if it's an increase in the private sector going into debt with itself. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like he said, the only reason that the money supply can go down is if it went up in the first place. That's not true. The money supply can go up or down depending on the political dials that are adjusted. And particularly in what's happening right now, that drop, he pulled up that FRED, the Federal Reserve. I don't know what FRED stands for, Federal Reserve something or other. Where'd it go?
Yeah, Federal
Did I lose it? Did I lose it? Here it is. So we do see, like going up to 2020, this massive increase in M2, what he's considering the money supply, and then COVID, we see this massive spending going into July 2022. And then after July 2022, it starts to peter off a little bit, which I believe is this end of the graph for him right here.
Correct.
Yeah, 2022 to 23 contraction. Now, we did a previous video. I don't know if it's too early to say this in the video that we're watching here, talking about what exactly happened in that contraction and why it wasn't as big of a deal. I mean, there were some fallout of it. The Silicon Valley Bank thing was one of them. But it's not as big of a deal in a meta sense as maybe this guy's making it out to be.
Yeah.
Nivi, do you want to explain that now, or do you want to see what this guy has to say first?
Yeah, let's keep on watching for a little bit.
Money supply. And that didn't change the outcome. And that actually makes sense because the only reason why you would have a contraction in the money supply is because of an artificial boom in the money supply. This is artificial boom bust cycle and answers the first part of our question earlier about how money can come into existence or leave existence. There was a time in the past when all money was gold coin or silver coin or other forms of commodities. But for the last few...
Did you want to comment on that or just let it stand?
Yeah, just let it stand.
200 years, that has simply been the base layer of money. On top of that, we would have paper notes or paper bills that were issued and were redeemable for that gold. Essentially, they were IOUs or they were forms of debt. And we know that one thing that is true about debt is that it is a promise to repay. And because debt is a promise to repay, it's possible to make too many promises to repay that cannot actually be repaid. This leads to fraudulent bankers and governments who decide that they want to issue too much paper currency as a way to spend more money than they actually have. When people find out, they go turn in their paper currency to get their gold and find out it wasn't actually there in the first place. And so as money is lent into existence, it is created by creating loans that have nothing there to back them up. People spend, times are good, and the total amount of money in circulation, those bills or those notes, it increases. Eventually something happens and triggers an unwind, and everybody goes to redeem their paper currency for real money, real wealth, or real goods, and the total amount of money in circulation plummets as it goes back to the base form of money. In the old case, that would have been gold or silver. But there's another way to measure the money supply growth.
There was a lot there.
Yeah, so he was talking about the gold standard specifically, which has been tried on occasion by certain countries over the past 3,000 years of generally fiat money systems, 3 to 5,000 years of generally fiat money systems. There have been attempts to reduce the inflation or enforce permanent deflation by imposing a gold standard, which basically means the government fixes the gold price and deficit spends but to a limited extent and is sort of forced to balance the budget on occasion. That is a system that's not really sustainable because it enforces austerity, and it's also not really, gold bugs, they think that that's a natural monetary system, but it really isn't. It's actually more like a fiat money system where the government enforces a fixed gold price. So they still had paper money back then. It was redeemable for gold and all that stuff, but that's more like a side note. It's still fiat paper money. There's still loans being made, and people expected that they would get gold for that money. And the reasons for the recessions, depressions are usually wars or austerity imposed by the government, and then all these other things happen because of those primary causes.
Well, and I also think it's important to emphasize here that he mentioned money that's not backed by anything and governments borrowing money that they don't have. It kind of begs the question of what's the correct amount of money, right? He seems to be implying that the correct amount of money should be whatever gold and silver stock that there is. But what's going on here, and we've talked about this, I don't know if ad nauseum is the correct term, but yeah. He's assuming the barter theory of money. Is that okay? I think what he's getting at is that there's a proper amount of money, which is whatever the gold and silver reserves are, and that anything that goes above and beyond that is money that banks and the governments are, in quotes, borrowing or creating out of nothing that's not backed by anything. And at some point, because that's happening, there's supposed to be this shock that sends it back closer to whatever that actual base amount is supposed to be.
Correct.
And what we argue is that the gold is, it's not entirely irrelevant because when you set up a gold standard, it does put a kink in the system. But the money gets its value not from the gold or the silver, but it gets its value from the fact that it's taxed to begin with. We don't run around looking for dollars throughout our day, going to work, investing in things, thinking about how we can improve our situation because we're trying to get a certain amount of gold. We're doing it because that's the tax token we need in order to pay our taxes and engage in the society that pays taxes in that unit of account. And so when the government prints it, what's that?
Yeah, when you say we do, it doesn't necessarily mean everyone has to pay taxes. It just means that a significant number of economic actors need the money to pay a tax. So that creates a universal demand for that.
Right. Well, and then I mean, I know sales taxes aren't universal in this state. I mean, in the United States, there's like two. They don't have sales tax. But let's say, for example, I don't owe any taxes because I'm on welfare or I do everything cash or whatever, and I go to the store. That store is good once its payment in dollars because it has to pay first and foremost sales tax on the thing that you just bought, and it's going to have to pay corporate taxes and payroll taxes and all this sort of stuff. So to Dima's point, even though you in particular don't file a 1040 because you don't owe anything, everything you interact with does.
Yes, exactly.
Right? So you still need that unit of account. And so the fact that taxes are demanded is what creates the value for the currency, whether it's gold or paper or digital units or whatever. And so the government, the where the money comes from and where it goes when it's created and destroyed, the government creates it out of nothing because that's what it does. It's got sovereign monopoly control over the issuance of its own currency, and then taxes it back and destroys it. And there's no like, oh, it's got to fall back to some base value at some point.
It doesn't have to happen, right? The economy can continuously grow if it grows sustainably, and if debt to income ratios don't, just go crazy,
Right.
then it would be sustainable. The causes of recessions, depressions, etc., are generally a lack of net private savings. In other words, too much money being taxed out of the economy in relation to what's been earned.
Absolutely. Let's keep going.
Growth, and this is a chart from long-term trends that goes back again to the 1800s, and you can see that by this measure the money supply hasn't contracted since the Great Depression. It's gotten close a few times where it has approached zero.
And just small thing, and I know this is what he meant, but I just want to be clear. The money supply isn't actually contracting. The growth is contracting, right?
No.
This is like year over year. Okay, we went up 2% from last year. We went up 4% from last year. We went down 2% from last year.
It is contracting compared to last year, but not compared to 10 years ago.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's a good point. It's not like when this goes negative at the end here, that's negative compared to the year before, not from 50 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But right now is the first time where it is actually broken into negative territory. And this is the final measurement of the money supply growth rate as measured by the Federal Reserve themselves, but this data only goes back to 1982. We can see that never since the Fed started collecting this data has the money supply actually entered into contraction territory until now. So by multiple measures, the money supply is contracting right now, and it hasn't done this for at least decades.
Yeah, but there's some measures that it's not contracting at all.
And by some measures since the Great Depression, but the extent to which the money supply is contracting is the most severe, at least since the Great Depression. Before that, it was fairly common. However, every time the money supply contracts, it's associated with at least recessions and depressions, and also sometimes wars, inflation, and deflation. But we have to take a look at this in more detail because it's not enough to just say, hey, the money supply is contracting. There's a few things that are very important to look at here. It's vital that we look at this in light of the actual absolute level of the quantity of money, as opposed to just looking at it from the standpoint of the rate of change. So this is a chart of M2, which is the money supply. And if we zoom in here, we can see that the money supply peaked in April of 2022. And for the next...
Again, M2 peaked in April of 2022. But an argument that we're making here is M2 isn't necessarily a good reflection of what the actual money supply is.
Yeah, let's pull up the other article. Actually, let me do that.
Which one? The U.S. money supply is making history for the first time. The MSN one.
No.
Actually, no. I like it. You pull it up.
Yeah.
And share your screen.
So I think this is time to explain why the money supply M2 has contracted since what's he saying? The July 2022.
2022. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let me pull that one up. Share. So you see it?
Yep.
Okay, so this was an article that reported on this issue at the time, August 2022. U.S. banks face trillion-dollar reverse repo headache. Um, the trillions of dollars overnight cash tucked away daily at the Federal Reserve could turn into a major headache for banks that could squeeze their balance sheets and impair their ability to lend. The Fed's Reverse Purchase Facility, RRP, has attracted a wide array of market participants, helping mop up excess liquidity in the financial system. Led by money market funds, volume at the reverse repo window has topped 2 trillion for 39 straight days. Okay, so what's the reverse repo? The reverse repo is without going into much detail, I think the easiest way to look at it, it's just another savings account that the Federal Reserve offers to its member banks to deposit their cash and earn a higher rate of interest than they would earn, for example, from the to
Than they otherwise would earn on these deposits that are sitting in the bank.
it's yes, it's a savings account that where they earn more money than in other places. Basically, it's a incentive. For example, they earn more money than holding it in treasury bills. So a lot of that money was basically moved from reserve accounts, from bank reserve accounts, to this reverse repo facility. And now the bank just, they deduct it from their reserve account and they add it to their reverse repo facility account, or whatever they call that thing, right? So
And then
this causes M2 to drop, but from the bank's perspective, it's not like they have less money or anything. It's just that
Yep.
they shifted it to an apparatus that's outside of the measurement.
Well, and I think it's worth considering, or maybe it's as simple as possible to say it this way: is that M2 is not accounting. So M2 is all cash, all savings, all money markets, and all CDs up to 100 grand. It's missing some very very core things that if you don't include them in M2, M2 starts bouncing up and down. And you're going, oh my God, what's going on? And it's something as mundane and boring as this reverse repo thing, where the Fed's going, okay, take it from this account and put it in that account. We'll give you a couple extra interest rate points. But the act of doing that took it out of M2 and put it out. I guess took it out of M2, right?
Yeah. To be maybe correct myself a little bit also. This reverse repo facility, from what I understand, it's something that a lot of funds have access to, money market funds, for example. So what happened in this period was that money market funds were offered a deposit vehicle that earns them more interest than a bank savings account, for example, right? So a lot of people were encouraged to pull their money out of.
So you and I could do it too, right? If I got 100 grand that I wanted to throw at it, I could do it too, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And then that money clears away from banks and goes to these money market mutual funds. And some banks did, in fact, have problems with this for other reasons, which is basically they had been, especially smaller banks, they had access to reserves at a very cheap interest rate for the longest time. Actually, a lot of those were checking accounts, which they don't pay any interest on. And at the same time, on their asset side, they had loans that were very low interest loans, mortgages, etc. And now a lot of depositors left these small banks. For example, Silicon Valley Bank, and what was the other bank? First Republic.
Yeah, First Republic. Yep.
So, I think these are more regional banks, and moved into money market accounts. And now these banks, in order to restore their position, their reserve position, as people start moving money out, they had to find much more expensive funding sources, savings accounts that pay an interest rate that can compete with these money market accounts, etc.
Or
And
going to the Federal Reserve itself and pulling money out of the credit line that they have at the Federal Reserve, right? They got to pay for that too.
that is a very expensive credit line, right? So they couldn't
Mhm.
really. That's not sustainable. That wasn't sustainable, at least given the loans that they had in their portfolios. They weren't paying enough interest to make this whole model work, and that's why I think Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic, why they went belly up, because investors started looking at their long-term balance sheet, and the prospect of future profitability had basically evaporated because of the new high interest rates that the Federal Reserve Bank would charge on
Mhm.
loans, and that they would enforce on the interbank lending market, where banks can borrow from each other. These rates had gone so high because of this competing option of just putting it away in the money market funds. So yeah, a lot of money was sucked out of there. And the root cause of all this is the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy. It's not necessarily QE or deliberate money injection or anything like that. It was rather the Federal Reserve had just declared that 5% is now the rate that we need to charge, because they believe that that fights inflation, which, as we know, it doesn't. There's no evidence that it does. The inflation that happened after the 2020 COVID stimulus would have naturally abated at a certain level after that whole stimulus was over. But now, of course, they've raised the rates. They're doing a victory lap, claiming they stopped inflation, all that stuff. If you look at long-term charts trying to correlate Federal Reserve interest rates to inflation, there's no such correlation. Um, so that was the reason why in July 2020, M2 money supply started dropping, just because some of this money moved into another facility that, if we want to track the money supply comprehensively, we would have to include that facility, and that wouldn't have changed the money supply.
And the bank still has access to that money. Or you and I, if we decided to put our money into that account, we still have access to that money. It didn't just vanish.
You and I have access to the money. Yeah, I mean, there's
Yeah.
some banks, like I said, Silicon Valley, First Republic, who were then snapped up by J.P. Morgan, who seemed to have trouble finding these reserves um, because the interest rate had gone up so high.
Well, and then it wasn't just that. I remember in the show that we did, there was something pretty fishy going on with the California Commissioner of Finance and whatever, where
It just
Silicon
seems-
Valley Bank almost had its stuff back together, and the commissioner just said, "I'm dissolving this financial entity." Boom!
It was declared
I declare it done.
It
Yeah.
was declared bankrupt by decree. It wasn't necessarily even, it didn't seem, at least, like from what we could tell, it didn't seem to be the case that anyone wanted money and didn't get paid. So, it didn't seem to be an organic situation, really. So yeah, that's also true. That's partially what happened there. But big picture, this money was reallocated to a different asset class, but it was still there. It wasn't gone. I mean, also we've seen since then, right? Since then, the stock market has hit new all-time highs. So if you'd said back then, April 2022, oh my God, the money supply is dropping, I got to sell all my stocks or short or whatever. If you fast forward to now, you wouldn't have done very well with that strategy. So again, our point is always economics should inform prudent financial decisions, and it should help you make better financial decisions.
Right. I'm going to go back to the video.
Yes.
This one. Here we go. Ah! Oops. How far along were we? Were we here? I think we were here.
It's vital that we look at this in light of the actual absolute level of the quantity of money, as opposed to just looking at it from the standpoint of the rate of change. So this is a chart of M2, which is the money supply. And if we zoom in here, we can see that the money supply peaked in April of 2022. And for the next year until May of 2023, it was on the decline. However, it is curious that since May of 2023, the money supply flatlined and stopped decreasing. So when we measure the amount of money in the money supply today compared to 1 year ago, yes, it is lower. But the actual level of the money supply hasn't changed since May. Now, that should be very suspicious considering the Federal Reserve has changed nothing about their monetary policy in that amount of time. The quantitative.
Or maybe all the people who were going to
Not-
buy the reverse repo program did it and they're done.
Well, it's not actually true that the Fed didn't change their monetary policy in or around, I would say July, maybe June, July, at the latest by August. Um, from their announcements, it was clear that they were done raising rates, and up to then, there was an expectation they were going to continue raising rates. So there was an expectation that there was more of this stuff because, like I always say, this reverse repo thing is just interest rate policy. It was a tool to implement their interest rate policy, and it's curious to note that when they stopped raising rates, or when they announced that they're pretty much done raising rates, most likely, uh, this money stopped moving out into these money market funds, into these reverse repo agreements. So I think that that's basically the reason why that thing leveled out that he's showing there in his chart.
Well, and that reminds me of something that we talked about. I think this may have been part of the permanent portfolio, is that when all these investors and market people are looking at where to make their money, always keeping in mind that the base interest rate, what you can get it for treasuries, that's like the base level. Like if treasuries are 5% right now, I know I can get 5% for nothing, no risk whatsoever, right? Now, if there's this reverse repo account that does 5.25%, I'm making up numbers, but you see my point. Well, then that becomes the base. And what you're saying is that once they stopped increasing the rate, even though everybody expected that rate to continue, everybody goes, okay, wait a minute, it's going to be frozen at 5%. Well, I might as well go look at the market and see if I can get better than 5% instead of waiting for the Federal Reserve to do it.
Well, and especially also what started happening is that they started announcing that
it's going to go down, right?
That they may be done and that they may start cutting rates, and the market's expectation, according to the betting markets, has been since then, August or July, August, maybe September of last year, maybe early October. I don't know when it shifted, but their expectations started becoming that the Fed is done raising rates, inflation is coming down, they're done raising rates. They're actually going to start cutting rates in June, maybe even in May, maybe even in March. And that was the expectation at one point towards the very end of last year, that they're going to start cutting rates in March. Now it's been clear for a little while now, for the past couple of weeks or months, that they are not going to start cutting that early, but
they're still going to cut. So for my future position, I'm not going to get 5% anymore. I better go find somewhere else to stick my money.
They're probably going to
stock market, right?
Yeah, they're probably going to start cutting sometime in May or June. And then what started happening was that when 30-year Treasury bonds reached a rate of somewhere over 5%, 5.1% or so, which was also coincidentally right around the time when I had to sell off some stocks and buy Treasury bonds because of the permanent portfolio strategy. That started reversing, and it dropped from 5 to like 3.9%, because people started realizing, okay, and now this gravy train is gone, and in fact they're going to start cutting rates. So what else is out there? So maybe some people put money back into their bank accounts, etc. The rate since then, like I said, the rate since then has fallen from 5% to 3.9%. Now, recently, it started moving back up to about 4.4% because of the shift, the delay. They expected it to start in March. Now it seems more like it's starting a few months later. So, yeah, these are all reasons why this drop in M2 has probably leveled out.
Let's see what he continues to have to say.
tightening that they're doing with their balance sheet is still ongoing. The interest rate hikes and holding them high have continued. They have not changed anything. So why did
Well,
the
they
money
did. We just
supply
talked
stop
about that.
shrinking suddenly in May and move sideways since then throughout the rest of the year? The answer to that is extremely important because it highlights, number one, what actually counts as money,
Like we were
and number
talking about.
two, what's going to happen as a result of this moving forward. But first, a word from today's sponsor, the Bullion
we're skipping
Card
this.
from AppMex. The Bullion Card is a revolutionary new way to spend your
There we go.
below. Okay, so the money supply was shrinking for about a year until May of 2023 when it flatlined and began moving sideways. This is despite the fact that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet continued to move down and they made no changes to their quantitative tightening.
Now, what correlation is he drawing here? He's saying, okay, the money supply didn't go up even though the Federal Reserve's balance sheet went down. Again, it looks like he's zooming in on one little aspect of what's going on and missing the bigger picture. You have a comment on that?
The Fed's balance sheet started going down because of quantitative tightening, I believe. So they started selling bonds, and that would, I don't know, that would technically.
Well, if they're selling bonds, that means they're bringing in reserves, so the balance sheet should go up, right?
Yes.
Or
if they're selling, bonds, then that means that bonds are moving to bank accounts and reserves are moving in. So reserves are a liability of the Fed, right? So the total net assets of the Fed go down when they sell. To be precise, when they let bonds mature without buying new bonds. That's what I meant by selling bonds, basically.
okay,
On the net, the amount of bonds on their balance sheets declines, right? So yeah, because the bonds constantly mature every quarter. Every quarter, the bonds mature, and basically at that point disappear from their balance sheet.
let me repeat that just so that's hammered in because I'm digesting it as you're saying it. Mm-hmm. Is that regardless of whatever the policy is, there's always old bonds maturing, and every time that I got $100 bond, it finally matured. You owe me $105 Federal Reserve, so they have to pay me $105 in reserves, which decreases their balance sheet by $105, right?
Yeah.
So
basically,
it's always happening.
Yeah, basically, when somebody pays off a bond, they use their reserves to send them to the Fed, and the Fed removes the bond, and the Fed doesn't hold reserves for themselves. So
right.
It basically disappears into it goes. The money supply contracts in that scenario when the bond matures.
Basically. So essentially, their balance sheet is always naturally going down from paying off bonds that are maturing unless they actively buy more bonds.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Continued to move down and they made no changes to their quantitative tightening. They also continued raising rates one more time and then held.
Well, sorry, one important thing to point out, it doesn't matter what the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is because they create money out of nothing.
Yeah, but it can, it gives us aggregate economic data that might be indicative.
Well, or I should say that the fact that we're seeing that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is going down, it's not like there's some thing that has to happen because of that.
Right.
Yeah.
No, technically, in our view, the Federal Reserve doesn't need to hold any bonds, really, technically. So
yeah.
They didn't lower rates, they didn't resume QE, but the money supply stopped shrinking. The reason why almost certainly has to do with another facility the Federal Reserve has called the reverse repo facility.
Oh,
You'll
he's getting into
notice, starting in May of 2023, the exact same month that the money supply flatlined, the reverse repo facility started to fall. Now, I've made plenty of videos about the reverse repo facility, how it works, why it's important, so I highly encourage you to go watch one of my recent videos on the reverse repo facility if you're not familiar. There are multiple measures of the money supply. We have M0, M1, M2, M3, and M2 is the most popular, most common measurement. It basically consists of all checking accounts, all savings accounts, and all
Maybe he's about to
retail
just
money
repeat
market
what we've been
funds.
saying the whole
But
time.
institutional money market
Yeah.
funds are not included. Now, anytime you set out to measure something as gray as the money supply, you're going to run into areas where you have to draw a line, and that line is somewhat arbitrary. Consider the thought experiment with me that the Federal Reserve decides to print $1 trillion physical cash, but they ship it off to Mars, and it just sits there on a pallet on Mars. Would you say that counts as the money supply? Well, no, because it is so far removed, it's not possible for it to enter circulation or anybody to use it. So it basically just doesn't even exist as far as we're concerned. Okay, so what if you take that same pallet of money and you put it in a vault underneath the Empire State Building? And again, nobody has access to it. It's locked away. Nobody knows the combination, but it's there. Well, again, you'd still probably say, no, it doesn't count. Nobody can access it. Now let's say that $1 trillion is not in a vault underneath the Empire State Building. Let's say it's in an account that you can't access for the next 12 months. You can't pull a single dollar out of it. Well, should we say that the money supply is increased now, or should we wait until 12 months when you have access to it? Well, most people would probably say, we'll wait 12 months until you can actually access it because it's not going to be coming out before that. So we start to see now the line between what counts as money in the money supply and not would be, is there a reasonable chance that that money will be used? And in the M2 definition of the money supply, that's basically all cash and liquid deposits minus institutional money market funds. And that distinction is important because most institutional money market funds were in the reverse repo facility. And starting in May, that money started to leave the reverse repo facility. Where is that money going though? That money is being lent to the US government for short-term debt called T-bills. And why did this start happening in May? Because starting in May, the interest rate paid.
I just have to say it. I'm sorry. The Federal Reserve is part of the U.S. government. FederalReserve.gov made a video about that.
On short-term government debt finally exceeded 5.3%. And 5.3% is the interest rate that the Fed pays inside the reverse repo facility. So all that cash was in the reverse repo facility because it was the safest way to get the best return on capital. But as soon as the government started borrowing more at those short-term rates, some of that cash said, oh, I'd rather get the higher rate instead. And as we know, when the government borrows, they borrow so that they can spend. And where do they spend? Into
Incorrect.
Somebody's bank account, whether it's into the bank account of somebody receiving Social Security or a healthcare provider the government is paying for, or a military industrial complex, or the paycheck of a politician. That money is going into a bank account. And as we know, bank accounts are included in the
if they need to investigate Trump for shaking hands with a Russian at some.
Oh, right. Yep, absolutely.
money supply. So as the reverse repo facility dwindles down, that money gets recirculated into the system and reintroduced into the money supply. It's not a perfect one-to-one, dollar for dollar, because again, institutional money market funds are not counted in the money supply. But as we can see, it is enough to almost perfectly offset the quantitative tightening that the Federal Reserve is doing. This means once the reverse repo facility hits zero, and it should do so by January, February, or March of 2024, there will be no more excess cash that is currently being counted outside of the banking system that could get reintroduced into the banking system, which means that the money supply will start to fall again. Of course,
I think it's easier to say that M2 is not an accurate descriptor of the money supply. But
Yeah.
that does necessitate that quantitative tightening will be continuing and that interest rates will still be where they're at. Because ultimately, the Federal Reserve does not directly control the amount of money that is in the money supply. They set the conditions for the base money, and then banks will lend real money.
Yeah,
into
actually,
existence.
much more importantly, will the money supply rise or fall? a much more important figure to watch will be the federal government's budget deficit. The larger it is, the more the money will grow, and if it shrinks slash if they start trying to balance the budget, which it doesn't look like they're going to do that, at least not in the U.S. anytime soon. But if they did that, then yeah, that would contract the money supply, and that would actually be a cause for some sort of alarm.
Well, and then to that point, I think that's a very, very concise way of saying we've got all these different things that we can look at. Okay, M2 is going up or down, or the repo rate's doing this, or the interest rate's doing whatever. That's all kind of window dressing. I mean, these things have some effect, but that's all really secondary to what's the government deficit? How much money is Congress spending into existence, or not?
Yeah, what's the government deficit, and also what's the current account situation? The sum of the two, basically.
Or not. And so conditions could absolutely change and these trends may not continue. But if all else does stay equal, then starting in January, February, and March, we will start to see the money supply start to shrink yet again. And as we've seen in the past, every time we see the money supply start to
unless the budget's passed, it's bigger.
Shrink, it happens during a time where there is a recession or a depression or wars. And the expectation that there is not going to be any economic pain simply based on the reasoning that no economic pain has started yet is a faulty assumption at best. When we have hundreds of years of history showing what happens when the money supply starts to shrink, even when it follows an expansion of the money supply, we should probably lean on the data.
No, wait. Didn't he just say, well, he opened this saying, hey, it looks like the money supply is shrinking, and he showed the M2 and all this sort of stuff, and then he said, oh, wait a minute, it's not actually shrinking because, it went into this,
Reverse repo?
Yes. It went into that, so it didn't really shrink, we're just measuring it differently.
Yeah, I don't know if
now he's going back saying, oh, it looks like it could shrink.
Yeah, I don't know if he concludes that the reverse repo also counts as a money measure or not, if he concedes that or not. Maybe he thinks that it's not as readily accessible as the M2 money supply, and hence it's bad if the M2 money supply falls. I'm not exactly sure.
Yep. And then Nima, I'm sorry, this thing's wigging out again. I can't move the size of the screens, although I can keep it playing. I'm going to keep it playing. There's only like a minute left. Yeah. But if something comes up the screen and we need to zoom in, I'm not going to be able to.
To be safe, instead of just burying our heads in the sand and saying, well, this time must be different. And if you're an accredited investor interested in learning how to self-manage your portfolio.
Oh, okay. He's blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's just a nice topic to illustrate how the financial system actually works. I'm not saying that this guy did like everything wrong or everything right. I think he's got some valid points, some blunders maybe, but it's a good topic to help understand how the whole money circulates and what these different terms mean: money supply, reverse repo, interest rates, and the money moving out of this into that. And keep the eye on the prize, which is basically what we call net private savings, what MMT people call net private savings, which is essentially the budget deficit plus the current account surplus. And if that number goes up, then things will likely be fine. If it drops below zero, then, or if the growth rate drops below zero, then there's cause for concern. And maybe we can do a separate show where we have a more detailed look at that very indicative figure.
Right.
But for the time being, it has slowed down, obviously, and that also explains why some stocks are not growing as explosively anymore as they have before, compared to the beginning of the COVID bonanza, the cash that was doled out like crazy in 2020, the following 2 years. So. Yeah. I don't know what else to say.
No, I'll wrap it up by saying this is that one of the things we talk about, the point of MMT or even if it's not MMT, the point of understanding that Congress is really the thing that makes the money or destroys the money is that all this other stuff, again, it's not like it's completely useless, the interest rates and the reverse repo and the balance sheet and all this sort of thing. There are effects to that. But if you're trying to measure what's going on by looking at all these secondary things, you're just going to go crazy. Because, I mean, like at the beginning when he brings out that chart and says, okay, look, when the money supply is dipped via M2, we've seen the depression, but then we pointed out, well, it doesn't predict this and it doesn't predict that, and that depression, I mean, that was Reconstruction after the Civil War. I mean, you can't just like take that in a vacuum, right?
Right.
And you end up with this like schizophrenic situation of it's up, it's down, it's down. Oh my God, what's going on? And then, I mean, you can just calm all that down and say that's all secondary stuff to the government deficit. And if you just watch that government deficit, you're going to know, like Nima just described, the real pulse of what's going on. Yes, like you could ruin a bank like Silicon Valley Bank or First Republic Bank by playing with these other things and jolting them. But again, in terms of the overall health of the economy, you got to look at the deficit.
Deficit and the export surplus.
Yes, thank you.
Figures. Yeah.
Thank you. Good. Well, I think it's the perfect time to end this because, like I said, I got this thing wigging out, and so let's just call it here and see everybody on the next video.
All right.
I read a TV.
Thank you, sir. I'm still live, I guess.